Good morning, and let me share with you something interesting. Psalms 102:17. He will regard the prayer of the destitute and not despise their prayers. Is there something about the wording of this that bothers you? He will regard the prayers of the destitute. I mean, I don't know about you, but somehow using the word regard, it sounds so impersonal. Sort of like God's going to, okay, the destitute are praying. I'll hear it. I'll give it some regard, give it some thought, maybe, make a decision here along the way what I'm going to do. And practically every modern translation walks in lockstep, taking this word regard as translated as regard. Some just say he will listen. Well, that's not that encouraging either. And the word in Hebrew for regard, it can have a number of different meanings. The word for regard is panah. Panah has a wide range of meanings, and all the way from listening, giving attention, facing, before. Also, it's a word used for the presence of God. Why do we have to stay with this word regard? It's almost like translators have to walk in lockstep with each other. And yet, God does more. At least in my mind, God does much more than regard to prayer. Regard to prayers. What's someone who's destitute? What do you think of when you hear the word destitute? You think of somebody who's reached the end of their rope. They have no other resources to go by. Actually, in Aramaic, the word, or in Hebrew, the word for destitute is be stripped naked. In ancient times, in our Western world, it's a little hard for us to understand because clothing is the easiest thing someone can get a hold of. There's no reason for a person to be without clothes. Even you see the homeless with a shopping cart full of clothes. Everybody has clothes. But in the early man in the first century and earlier, clothing was highly prized. Cloth making was a very expensive, very difficult process. And usually most people just had one set of clothes, and that was it. Among the Jews, they would have two sets if they could afford it, because on the Sabbath they would wear something different. They had one clothes they wore 6 days a week, and then one set they wear on the Sabbath. But many Jews, they couldn't even afford that. So come the Sabbath, they'd have to roll up their sleeves or skirt or whatever, just so it would be different than what they were wearing during the week. And people who were traveling, bandits would descend on them. Bandits weren't looking for their wallets. They weren't looking for credit cards. Most people didn't carry money or anything with them. All they had was the clothing they wore, and that was valuable to the thieves. That was valuable to the bandits. If you recall the story of the Good Samaritan, where he helped a man who was stripped naked, and literally that's what it was. They stripped all the clothes off of him, took the most valuable thing he had, his clothes. So that's where this word destitute comes from, is being stripped naked, taking the most valuable thing you've got, taking practically everything you've got. And yet the word era for destitute can also, Rabbi Samson Hirsch, a 19th century linguist and Hebrew master, gives the English words isolation, loneliness for this word as rather than destitute. And I liked it a little better. Now the context, we talked about this verse yesterday in our Midrash, which unfortunately we don't record, but we talked about the various meanings of these words. And the idea would be that the Lord regards The word regard is panei, which can also be your presence. The Lord's presence encompasses the prayer of the destitute, or the prayer of the isolated, or the prayer of the lonely. And for me, that is a much better translation. The context is about Zion and Israel that was taken into captivity, but God promises He's going to restore them, and He's going to regard the prayers of those who were destitute during this time of captivity. Well, of course, it's written for us as well, for the individual. There's multiple levels of understanding to these verses. And I would read this, that God's presence encompasses those who are lonely. Now, loneliness is something that we in the Western world can understand. Very few in this Western world are stripped naked and can't even afford clothes. You can get clothes anywhere, churches and community centers and Goodwill and so forth. A person needs a coat, they'll be able to find a coat somewhere. There's some organization that will give them a winter jacket if they need one. So that's not a problem for us in the Western world. But what is a problem for many in the Western world is loneliness. And even more so now is they're finding friends online. As with Facebook here, I've got I don't know how many friends on Facebook, friends I've never met, never talked to, but they're listed as friends. And so loneliness can be a problem. And God's presence encompasses the lonely when they pray. God just doesn't, when you cry out in the midst of your loneliness, He just doesn't stand up there and regard it, think about it. Guy, I guess he is pretty lonely, kind of bad. Maybe I'll do something about it. I don't know. I'll think about it. That's what I get regard. I like the idea of using a word for panai as His presence. His presence encompasses those who are lonely. When you are lonely and you pray, God's presence will encompass you. You realize you're not alone. The God of the universe is there right with you every moment of the day. I've talked many times how God doesn't live in time. He can spend every second, every moment with you, and not give any regard to anybody else, because He moves through time, and He can give every individual that personal attention. I remember hearing a mother who's had 12 children, and one of the children died, and she felt very lonely. She had 11 other children. How could she feel lonely? But the loss of that one created that sense of loneliness. And so too with God. He may have 100 sheep or 99 sheep. If he had 100 and one was lost, He needs that one. It's lonely without that, with that one sheep missing. And so too, He has, and another way of looking at it is He's created, look at it in the terms of quantum physics. He created a separate universe for you. You and Him live in your own personal universe, though you interact with others in their universes. He's got your own, He's given you your own universe that you and He share. And what happens if you're not praying to Him, if you're not talking to Him, if you're not giving Him regard? Well, that's a pretty lonely thing for God, to share a universe with you and you alone, and then you're giving Him no attention. God understands loneliness, because we create loneliness for Him. Our disregard to Him makes Him lonely. Paul says, pray without ceasing. How can you pray without ceasing? One idea behind that in the Jewish thought is that when Moses was told in the burning bush, go tell the people, Moses said, well, what name am I going to use? and he said, I'm thick of tongue, or he has a speech problem. The Talmud teaches he had a thick tongue, and he couldn't pronounce words. That tongue you can hardly, and that it's the way Moses would talk. He couldn't, every name of God he couldn't pronounce it because he had that thick tongue. So God gave him a name where he didn't have to use his tongue. He would say it with his breath. Yahweh. Yahweh. And the Talmud teaches every time you take a breath, you speak the name of God. And that's what Paul was saying in Pray Without Ceasing. Every breath you take, you speak the name of God. You're calling upon God. Is there a praise in that breath? Is there a request in that breath? Is there a petition in that request? Is there intercession in that request? And you're communicating with God. And you're joined with God. I was reading in the Talmud yesterday how they teach that when you pray, your spirit is joined with the Spirit of God, and God is praying with you. You're just not praying alone. But the prayer you're praying in the Spirit, God is also praying at the same time. He's joined with you in prayer. And when you take a breath, if you're aware of God, you've offered a prayer. And so when Paul said, pray without ceasing, what he was basically saying is always remember you're in the presence of God. Whatever you do, whatever you say, let it be as unto God. And then you're praying without ceasing. For every breath you take is a prayer.